They had names. Most of them you have never heard. Paul Warburg, Benjamin Strong, Montague Norman, Harry Dexter White. These were not presidents, not generals, not elected by anyone, not accountable to any parliament, and not subject to any democratic review. Yet between 1910 and 1971, this small group of men, bankers, treasury officials, and central bank governors operating in deliberate obscurity, made decisions that determined the price of food in Lagos, the collapse of currencies in Buenos Aires, the bankruptcy of governments in Athens, and the purchasing power sitting in your wallet right now, in the present day. They did not operate in public. They traveled under false names. They met in private resorts, luxury hotels, and sealed conference rooms with no press, no cameras, and no oversight. What they designed in those rooms was not merely a financial system. It was an architecture of permanent control, one so elegantly constructed that most of the people living inside it would never recognize it as a structure at all. They would simply call it the economy. They would call it how things work. Here is the number that should stop you cold. As of today, global sovereign debt exceeds $100 trillion. It has never, in the modern era, been on a trajectory toward repayment. Not once. Not even close. This system was not built to be paid off. It was built to be perpetuated. And the men who designed it knew that from the very beginning. This is their story. And it is yours. This is where history, power, and money converge, where the hidden mechanics of the world are examined without apology. Consider this paradox. In 1900, the British Empire controlled roughly 24% of the world's land surface and governed 400 million people. It was the undisputed center of global finance. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London's banks financed railways in Argentina, cotton plantations in Egypt, rubber extraction in Malaya. If you wanted to conduct business anywhere on the planet, you needed sterling, and you needed London's approval. By 1950, that empire was financially exhausted, indebted to a former colony, and watching its currency be systematically replaced by a new global standard it had almost no power to refuse. In less than half a century, the most powerful financial empire in human history had been displaced, not by military conquest, but by the quiet, deliberate construction of a new financial architecture designed in America, for America. The paradox is this: the 20th century's greatest power transfer was not political, it was financial, and it happened not through revolution or war, but through agreements signed in luxury hotels, emergency telegrams between central bankers, and the patient, strategic maneuvering of institutions that most people cannot name and have never been asked to vote for. The global financial order you live inside today, with its dollar-denominated debt, its IMF conditionality programs, its World Bank development loans, its credit rating agencies that can destroy a government with a single-letter downgrade, was not an accident of history. It was a construction, deliberate, calculated, architecturally precise, and the blueprints were drawn by fewer than 100 men across 4 critical decades. Understanding who they were, what they built, and why it still holds is not an academic exercise. It is the most important act of financial self-defense available to any citizen alive today. To find the origin of this architecture, you must go back to November 1910, to a private railway car departing from a station in New Jersey, carrying 7 men under instructions of absolute secrecy. They used false names. They carried no identifying documents. They traveled at night. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a private resort off the coast of Georgia, accessible only by boat and owned exclusively by members of America's most powerful financial families. The men in that railway car represented, by some estimates, approximately 1/4 of the entire world's wealth. Among them, Nelson Aldrich, the most powerful Republican senator in America and the maternal grandfather of future President Nelson Rockefeller. Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, the largest bank in the United States; Henry Davison, senior partner of J.P. Morgan and Company; Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who had spent years studying the central banking systems of Europe and was determined to transplant their mechanisms onto American soil; and Benjamin Strong, who would later become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, arguably the single most powerful financial position in the world. They spent 9 days on Jekyll Island. When they returned, they carried a draft document that would, in modified form, become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The creation of the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, was the first pillar of the new financial architecture, and it was designed from its very beginning not merely as a public institution to stabilize the American economy, but as a mechanism through which private banking interests could shape monetary policy with a degree of insulation from democratic accountability that would have been politically impossible to achieve openly. This is not conspiracy. This is documented history, available in the memoirs of participants, the records of congressional hearings, and the biographies of the men involved. The Federal Reserve Act gave the new institution the power to set interest rates, to issue currency, to act as lender of last resort to the banking system, and to coordinate, formally or informally, with central banks abroad. The men who designed it understood that whoever controlled the money supply of the world's largest growing economy would, in time, shape the monetary conditions of the entire globe. 4 years after the Federal Reserve was created, the United States entered the First World War. When the war ended in 1918, America held the world's largest gold reserves and its most imposing creditor position in history. The financial architecture had found its moment, and its builders were ready to expand. The mechanism built between 1918 and 1944 was elegant in its design and brutal in its consequences. It had 3 interlocking components. The first was the dollar. By the end of World War I, European currencies had been ravaged by inflation, debt, and the abandonment of the gold standard. Britain attempted to restore sterling to its pre-war parity in 1925, a catastrophic miscalculation that produced deflation, mass unemployment, and the general strike of 1926. Germany had already been consumed by the hyperinflation of 1923, when its currency lost so much value that the Reichsbank eventually printed 100 trillion mark notes. France was perpetually unstable. In this environment of European monetary chaos, the dollar, backed by the world's largest gold reserve and its most productive industrial economy, emerged as the only truly credible currency on the planet. The architects understood this dynamic and exploited it deliberately. They did not need to campaign for dollar supremacy. They simply needed to ensure that the United States remained financially stable while Europe continued to destabilize. The second component was the network of central banks. Beginning in the early 1920s, Benjamin Strong at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York cultivated a web of relationships with European central bankers: Montague Norman at the Bank of England, Émile Moreau at the Bank of France, Hjalmar Schacht at the Reichsbank. These men communicated by private telegram, coordinated interest rate decisions across borders, and worked to manage exchange rates, often without the knowledge of their own governments. They believed, sincerely in most cases, that monetary stability required insulation from politics, that professional central bankers understood money better than elected politicians. This belief became one of the foundational ideologies of the 20th century financial order. It also meant that some of the most consequential economic decisions of that century were made by unelected technocrats whose primary loyalty was to the stability of the system, not to the populations the system was supposed to serve. The third component was the institutional phase, and it reached its culmination in July 1944 in the mountains of New Hampshire, at the Mount Washington Hotel in a small town called Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods was not a neutral peace conference. It was a negotiation between a financially exhausted Britain and a financially triumphant America, with 42 other nations present mostly as witnesses to the new hierarchy being formalized. The British delegation was led by John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most brilliant economist of the century, who arrived with a sophisticated proposal for a genuinely international monetary system. He proposed the creation of a global currency he called the Bancor, issued by an international clearing union, with both surplus and deficit nations sharing the burden of economic adjustment. It was designed to prevent any single country from dominating the global monetary order. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White of the U.S. Treasury, rejected it completely. The United States held 70% of the world's gold reserves in 1944. It had no interest in a system where its surplus position would be penalized or its monetary dominance diluted. White's counter-proposal was simple and decisive. The dollar would be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce, and all other currencies would be fixed to the dollar. The world would adopt the dollar as its reserve currency, and the United States would guarantee convertibility. Keynes, already gravely ill, he would die less than 2 years later, understood precisely what this arrangement meant. He noted, in private correspondence, that the United States was being handed a financial privilege that no empire in history had ever possessed in precisely this form: the ability to issue the world's reserve currency, running trade deficits indefinitely, buying real goods from other nations, and paying for them with paper it printed itself. Other nations had to earn dollars through production and exports. America simply had to print them. 2 new institutions emerged from Bretton Woods, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both were headquartered in Washington. Both were structured to give the United States an effective veto over major decisions. Both were designed, in theory, to promote global stability and development. In practice, over the following decades, they became instruments through which the financial architecture was extended into the developing world, attaching conditions to loans that consistently favored the interests of creditor nations over the sovereignty of debtor ones. The web was now global, the mechanism was complete, and the architects had achieved something no empire before them had managed through military force alone: a financial system in which the entire world's transactions were denominated in their currency, cleared through their banks, and ultimately dependent on their decisions. But the architecture was not static. It evolved, and its most powerful evolution came not from the governments or central banks, but from the private financial institutions that grew in their shadow. By the 1960s, a new market had emerged that even the architects of Bretton Woods had not fully anticipated: the eurodollar market. These were dollar-denominated deposits held in banks outside the United States, principally in London, beyond the regulatory reach of the Federal Reserve. By 1970, this market was worth an estimated $50 billion. By 1980, it had expanded to approximately $2 trillion. By the end of the century, it had grown into the tens of trillions, forming the invisible foundation of global dollar liquidity that no single institution fully controls or even fully measures today. This market was the first signal that the architecture was beginning to exceed the control of its creators. Money, once released at global scale, develops its own momentum. New actors entered the system: hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, investment banks operating simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions, and, beginning in the 1970s, the recycled petrodollars from OPEC nations that fundamentally altered the global flow of capital. When OPEC raised oil prices by 380% in 1973, it did not simply cause a fuel crisis. It generated an enormous surplus of dollars in the hands of oil-producing states with limited domestic investment capacity. Those dollars were deposited in Western banks, primarily in London and New York. Those banks, facing low domestic demand for credit, recycled the petrodollars into loans to developing nations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It appeared efficient. It appeared rational. It was, in retrospect, the structural blueprint for a catastrophe. And here is where the credit rating agencies entered the story with consequences few anticipated. Moody's was founded in 1909. Standard & Poor's traces its origins to 1860. For most of their history, they were modest, relatively obscure institutions rating corporate bonds. But as sovereign debt markets exploded in the 1970s and 1980s, their assessments became determinative of national fate. A single rating downgrade, from investment grade to speculative, from BBB to BB, could trigger capital flight, spike borrowing costs, and force devastating austerity measures on entire populations. 3 private American companies, accountable only to their shareholders and not to any democratic process, acquired the effective power to discipline the fiscal policies of sovereign nations. This was the invisible layer of the architecture that Bretton Woods never officially sanctioned, but ultimately made possible. Private power embedded inside a public-facing system, amplifying the preferences of creditors over debtors at every turn, in every cycle, without exception. The abstract becomes concrete when you examine what happened to nations that found themselves on the wrong side of this architecture. Argentina borrowed heavily throughout the 1970s, encouraged by the same Western banks, flush with petrodollars and eager to deploy capital. By 1982, interest rates had been raised dramatically by the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker, a decision taken primarily to combat American inflation, and the effect on Latin American debtors was immediate and devastating. Argentina's debt service costs became unmanageable overnight. The country entered a prolonged crisis that culminated in the 2001 default, the largest sovereign default in history at that point, erasing the savings of millions of middle-class Argentinians whose bank deposits were frozen by government decree. People who had worked their entire lives, who had saved in dollars precisely because they trusted dollar stability, woke to find their accounts inaccessible and their accumulated wealth gone. Mexico declared insolvency in 1982, triggering the Latin American debt crisis that consumed the entire continent for nearly a decade. Sub-Saharan African nations, similarly trapped by commodity price collapses and dollar-denominated debts they had been aggressively encouraged to take on, entered structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF, requiring cuts to public health, education, and infrastructure spending as conditions for continued credit access. The human cost, measured in preventable deaths, lost educational generations, and entrenched intergenerational poverty, was staggering and remains inadequately acknowledged in a mainstream economic discourse. Greece offers the most recent and most visible example within the developed world. By 2010, the Greek state faced insolvency. Its debt had reached 130% of GDP. The European Troika stepped in with a rescue package attached to stringent conditions: wage cuts, pension reductions, fire sale privatizations of public assets, and austerity measures that contracted the Greek economy by 25% over 5 years. Greek unemployment reached 27%. Youth unemployment exceeded 60%. The private bondholders who had lent recklessly to Greece were largely protected from losses. The Greek population absorbed the full weight of the adjustment. The pattern is consistent across decades, continents, and crises. The architecture does not distribute pain equitably. It distributes it according to power. Here is the revelation that changes how you read everything above. The global financial order was never designed to be repaid. This is not rhetoric. It is structural. The dollar-based system requires the United States to run persistent trade deficits in order to supply the rest of the world with the dollars it needs to conduct international trade, service sovereign debts, and hold in reserve. America must perpetually spend more than it earns from abroad, exporting dollars, importing goods. The system is only viable as long as those deficits continue. If the United States balanced its trade accounts, the global economy would face a dollar shortage severe enough to trigger deflation and economic contraction worldwide. The engine of global commerce runs on American debt. Global sovereign debt today exceeds $100 trillion. It has never, in the modern era, been on a trajectory toward genuine repayment. It grows in absolute terms every single year, in every major economy. The system is not designed to reduce it. It is designed to manage it, to roll it over, refinance it, restructure it when necessary, and ensure that the interest payments continue flowing to creditors, while the principal remains permanently outstanding, generation after generation. This is the hidden motor of the 20th century financial order, not growth, not development, not poverty alleviation, but the perpetual expansion of debt as a mechanism for transferring resources from debtors to creditors, from the economic periphery to the center, from the many to the very few. The architects of this system were not, in most cases, villains in any simple sense. They were intelligent men operating with coherent theories and genuine beliefs about how economies function best. But their theories consistently privileged creditor interests. Their institutions consistently protected lender rights. Their structures consistently removed from debtor nations the flexibility needed to recover, grow, and serve their own populations first. And the populations, almost universally, never knew the rules of the game they were playing inside. The entire architecture rests on a single, fragile foundation: confidence. The dollar is not backed by gold. It has not been since August 15, 1971, when President Nixon announced, without warning, without multilateral negotiation, in a Sunday evening television address, that the United States would no longer honor the Bretton Woods commitment to convert dollars into gold at $35 per ounce. The gold window was closed permanently. The dollar became, in technical terms, a fiat currency, backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the United States government and the enormous structural inertia of global commerce built around it. That moment, known as the Nixon shock, was one of the most consequential unilateral financial decisions of the entire 20th century. It effectively ended the Bretton Woods system as it had been designed, yet left its institutional infrastructure completely intact. The IMF, the World Bank, and the dollar's reserve currency status all survived the end of gold convertibility. They survived because no alternative architecture was ready to replace them, and because the United States retained sufficient geopolitical power to enforce the continued use of dollars for global commodity trade. The petrodollar arrangement formalized in the early 1970s through agreements between Washington and Riyadh. The system, then, is held together not by gold, not by law, not by democratic mandate, but by inertia and by the absence of a credible alternative. This is simultaneously its greatest strength and its most profound vulnerability, because confidence, once broken, does not break slowly. It breaks all at once. Every financial crisis of the modern era, 1929, 1971, 1982, 1997, 2008, was a moment when confidence faltered, when enough participants simultaneously questioned whether the promises embedded in the system were backed by anything real. In each case, the response followed the same template: new promises, new institutions, new injections of liquidity, new frameworks designed to restore confidence in a system whose fundamental architecture remained unchanged. The debt was never reduced. The structural imbalances were never corrected. Confidence was simply repurchased at the cost of more debt borne by those least equipped to carry it. The consequences of this architecture for human inequality are not incidental effects or unintended byproducts. They are structural outputs of the system's deliberate design. Between 1980 and 2020, the share of global wealth held by the top 1% of the population increased from approximately 25% to nearly 40%. This occurred during precisely the period when the financial architecture reached its fullest global extension. When capital controls were dismantled across the developing world, when financial markets were deregulated in the name of efficiency, when sovereign debt markets in emerging economies were fully integrated into global capital flows for the first time, When capital is free to move across borders in search of the highest return, it flows to where returns are highest, which is typically where regulatory environments are weakest, labor costs are lowest, and governments are most desperate for any investment at all. The tax revenues that might fund public services follow the capital offshore into structures that are technically legal, institutionally complex, and effectively beyond the reach of any government that might otherwise redirect them toward public welfare. The transfer of wealth that this architecture enables is not visible in any single transaction. It is embedded in the compound interest on sovereign debt, in the spread between borrowing costs for rich and poor nations, in the currency arrangements that force commodity exporters to sell in dollars while purchasing manufactured goods at prices set by others. It is structural, it is systematic, it is accelerating, and it was engineered, not accidental. There is a sentiment attributed to various banking figures across the 19th and 20th centuries, its precise origin debated but its content never seriously challenged, that captures the architecture this history has traced with more precision than any economics textbook ever could. Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws. Control of the money supply, of the rules by which credit is created, the conditions under which it is extended, the institutions through which it flows, is the deepest and most durable form of power the modern world has produced. It is more enduring than military occupation, more pervasive than political ideology, and far more difficult to recognize than either. It does not require troops. It does not require elections. It requires only that the mechanisms remain invisible and that the population continues to mistake the architecture for nature. The men who gathered on Jekyll Island in 1910 understood this. The architects of Bretton Woods understood this. The designers of structural adjustment programs understood this. The hedge fund managers, sovereign bond traders, and central bank governors who operate the evolved version of this system today understand this. The question, the only question that matters, is whether everyone else does. The architecture of the 20th century's financial order was built to be invisible, built to feel natural, inevitable, technically incomprehensible, and politically neutral, built to appear as if it were simply how economies function, as if no other arrangement were conceivable, no alternative possible. Every generation that accepts this appearance without examination becomes the next foundation upon which the architecture rests, the next population from which the debt service is extracted, the next group of people asked to sacrifice for a system they were never invited to design and never asked to endorse. The hidden architects are no longer hiding. Their institutions are visible. Their founding documents are declassified. Their blueprints are in the historical record, accessible to anyone willing to look without flinching. The only thing that keeps the architecture intact, more than gold reserves, more than military power, more than legal enforcement, is the widespread belief that it cannot be otherwise. That belief is the most powerful financial instrument ever created. It requires no vault. It costs nothing to maintain. And like every instrument of concentrated power throughout history, it serves those who hold it and remains invisible to those who never knew it existed. History does not ask your permission to repeat itself. It simply does, until enough people understand the mechanism well enough to refuse it.
If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. Money follows rules. History exposes them.